Everyone here, I wanted to thank you all for joining the Wild Ones Greater Baltimore chapter. I think this will be a really fun and educational talk all about pollinator gardens by educator and naturalist Kerry Wixted. Kerry is a popular speaker, and we're grateful she could fit us into her schedule. I should say she gathers no moss with all of the workshops, talks, writing, and educational and outreach she does, not the least of which is being a dedicated guinea pig mom. But I suspect that she does stop from time to time to gather whatever moss catches her eye. To learn more about Kerry, you can visit her website at kerrysnature.org. And speaking of websites, if you or a friend would like to join or support Wild Ones Greater Baltimore, please visit our website at baltimore.wildones.org. And I'm going to welcome Kerry and let her take over the screen.
Thanks, Amanda. Very excited to be here to talk about gardening for pollinators. Perfect topic because National Pollinator Week is coming up in 2 weeks. So you can get geared up for celebrating pollinators all week long. And before that, next week is Wild Turtle Week. So I'll put that plug in as well. So welcome everyone. My name again is Kerry Wixted, and I used to work with Department of Natural Resources and did a lot of work teaching people how to do backyard wildlife habitat through the Wild Acres program, which is still continuing on through Maryland DNR. And there are a lot of great resources on that website that if you're interested in kind of jumping into this a little bit further. So to start off, I just kind of wanted to cover different animals that pollinate, because generally when I ask people who is a pollinator, the first two that come out usually are butterflies and bees. But there are a lot of other species that actually help to pollinate in our area. And around the world, there's a huge diversity of pollinators. There are even some lizards that pollinate and some mammals that pollinate and things of that nature. Our only true vertebrate pollinator, the one with a backbone in our area, are our ruby-throated hummingbirds that we have here. And then everybody else lacks a backbone. So we've got our bees, our wasps, our flies. They're flower flies. That picture in the upper right-hand corner is actually from my yard. And that's one of our hoverfly species that's visiting some spiderwort. We have moths that pollinate. We have wasps that pollinate. So that picture down there in the bottom, in the middle, is taken by a local photographer of a yellow jacket pollinating some cucumber flowers there. And you can definitely see that pollen is all stuck to it in that process. There are even things like ants that help with pollination of certain plants. And one thing to know about the world of pollinators, there's some that are really good at pollinating and some that aren't so good but kind of accidentally move things around. So as you might expect, things that are super hairy, like our bees and our wasp and some of our moths, are actually pretty good at pollinating because that hair is that pollen sticking to those hairs. Whereas things like butterflies and ants and those types of organisms, not as good at pollinating because they're good at drinking nectar, but not necessarily moving that pollen from plant to plant to help with that fertilization. So you can actually look at flowers and get an idea of who typically pollinates those flowers. And that's all based on this kind of structure versus function known as pollinator syndromes. So if we had bats that pollinate in our area, they're more in tropical areas like in Central and South America, but they like to go things that have white flowers, that's strong and fruity scents and bloom at night. So things like agave, which gives us tequila, that's what attracts the bats. And things that attract bees are usually bright white, yellow, or blue, and they often have kind of a shallow landing platform. So think about like a lot of our asters and daisies and those types of things. Those are traditionally plants that are pollinated by bees. Our earlier plants are pollinated by beetles. So things in the magnolia family in particular that have those kind of whitish flowers that might be fruity or spicy, but also large and bowl-like. And so, you know, beetles were some of the first pollinators on the scene years and years ago. And that's why you see a lot of the ancient lineages of plants like magnolias still having those beetle relationships. For things like our hummingbirds, as you might know, they go after orange, red flowers that are tubular in shape, like trumpet honeysuckle flies. The flies that are pollinators often go for things that are brown or purple and extremely stinky. So things like pawpaw flowers are loved by flies and skunk cabbage and things of those nature. And then for plants that are not pollinated by an animal that use things like wind to help pollination, they have no reason to put any energy into color or scents or showy flowers. They're all about producing structures that produce as much pollen as possible to throw out into the wind and help them essentially get that pollen to where it needs to be. So keep that in mind. If a plant has a showy flower, if it has a strong scent, whether it's a good scent or a bad scent, it's putting energy into that, and that means it is pollinated by some type of animal, not wind or water. So with that, here's your first quiz. We got two flowers here. We have bee balm, which is one of my absolute favorite flowers. Likes wetter habitats here in Maryland, so my yard is not a very good spot for it. Looking at the flower color and the flower shape, who do you think would traditionally go for bee balm? He was paying attention. You can type it in the chat there. Who would be pollinating the bee balm? And then on the right-hand side, we've got our goldenrod, and that's going to have those yellow flowers. This is in the aster family. This is showy goldenrod, which has really big flowers. So I'm seeing a vote for hummingbirds for the bee balm. Another vote for hummingbirds. Yeah, bee balm is a hummingbird magnet. Now, interestingly enough, its cousins have different colors. So wild bergamot, which does grow really well in my dry yard, is actually preferred mostly by our solitary wasp because it has a different color, even though it has a similar shape to it. And then the bees, yeah, they're definitely going to be going after that goldenrod. And goldenrod actually is pretty awesome too in terms of food for our migrating monarchs. So moving along to our bees are by far the best pollinators that we have on the scene. And Maryland has over 430 or 450 species of bees. So we have a tremendous number of bees that are represented in the state, majority of which are considered to be solitary, in that essentially the females have to do all the work. So once they emerge from their nests, they have to go and find a nest, or they have to mate, find an area to nest in, or create a nest, provision it with food, lay the eggs, and do all the things in her very, very short life cycle. And she's doing it all by herself. In contrast, some of our bee species are social, where that queen comes out of hibernation in the springtime, starts to build the colony, and she starts to build clones or workers of herself, and then the colony all starts to work together, and then they have that division of labor where some are supposed to go and tend to the babies, and some of them have to go out and forage, and some of them are cleaners. So when you have these social bees, like our bumblebees and a lot of our social wasps, honeybees and all of that, you have a greater chance of them coming after you and stinging you because they've got the time to defend their nests and they've got a lot more at stake. Compared to things like our solitary bees, where she's a single mom, and I always joke she ain't got time to sting you because she's got to collect as much pollen as possible, and sometimes only a 1 or 2 week lifespan that she has. And in our solitary bee world and our social bee world, a lot of them are nesting in the ground, some of them are nesting in tubes and tunnels, and some, like our bumblebees, will utilize structures like bird houses or old rodent nests for their housing. So majority of our solitary bees are actually ground nesters. And so a lot of them have these short cycles, only 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And even though they nest in solitary conditions where a single hole belongs to a single female, if the conditions are right, they're going to aggregate. So you'll see these large colonies, particularly in sandy soils, like what I have down in Anne Arundel County where I'm at. So these ground nesters have different times of year that they're active, and they're also, some of them are very specialized in terms of the things that they're going to visit. For example, one of our earliest ground nesting bees that's going to come out is the spring beauty bee. And they're one of my favorites because spring beauty pollen is pink, and so you can't really see it really well in this picture, but they usually fly around with little pink pollen pants on, so it makes it really nice and easy to notice them. The males also have a white mustache on their face, so it's easier to distinguish the males from the females in the spring beauty bee world. But they're the ones that are almost exclusively pollinating spring beauty. And so they have this very specialized relationship. If the spring beauty is lost, then we're going to lose the bee. And if the bee leaves or something happens to the bee, that means that that pollination success for spring beauty is also going to decline. So we see a lot of these specialized relationships with the plant pollinator world. And I want to say around 20% of our bee species are specialists in that they only visit maybe one or two species or one genera of species. And you don't see that quite as often in some of our insect groups, but a specialist that you might be familiar with are monarchs, which only lay their eggs on milkweeds. For those of you who have your veggie gardens, this squash bee, which looks a lot like the non-native honeybee, is actually one of your best friends to have out there. So squash bees, as their name suggests, are essentially pollinators of things in the cucumber family. So cucumbers, squashes, and all of the like. The females will nest in the ground. The males, because they don't make a nest, oftentimes will spend the night overnight in the squash flowers. So when you start getting your zucchini buds and all of that, one of my favorite things to do in the morning was to like gently tease them open and look at the little slumbering male squash bees as they're sleeping in those flowers. So keep an eye out. That's a good sign that you've got some good habitat if you're supporting those squash bees. And then we have others that are generalists, like the plaster bees. These are super, super common. Early in the spring, you'll see tons and tons of their nests all around, especially you have clayey soil and all of that. And they'll visit some of the different wildflowers that are blooming in the spring. And we do have spring ground nesters and summer ground nesters, so you'll see them active at different times of the year. So unfortunately, despite the importance of pollinators for all the things that they do, I mean, it's estimated that 1 in every 3 bites of food that we eat is thanks to pollinators. We wouldn't have beautiful things like chocolate if it wasn't for pollinators, or coffee, or those types of things. And certainly these pollinators are helping out the plants and feeding us, but they're also feeding all sorts of other organisms. So the majority of our songbirds here in the eastern United States require squishy protein to feed their babies. And that squishy protein often comes in the form of juicy caterpillars. So it's estimated that some of our chickadee families take anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 caterpillars just to feed one batch or one brood of young. And if you think about how little chickadees are compared to some of our larger songbirds, that's a lot of caterpillars that we need on our landscapes. And then when you look at the numbers, we start to see that there's some massive declines in insects all around the world. So this isn't just a Maryland thing or a United States thing. This is a global insect decline that we're seeing all around the world, which is ultimately going to affect our different ecosystems and the things that we depend on. So the beautiful thing about pollinators, though, is because they're small, you can do a lot in small spaces like your backyards, or even a porch or a deck or things like that, compared to some of the species that I work with in my day job that need acres and acres of land to be able to restore the habitat for them. So ultimately, the recipe for success for these different pollinator species is to plant native species, species that co-evolved with these pollinators. And when you're planting for them, things to think about are planting species that are going to provide that food, either in the form of nectar and or pollen, as well as things that are going to provide that habitat, like nests and nursery sites. It's really, really important if you want to help out the pollinators, thinking about the whole life cycle and how you can support that life cycle of those animals instead of just one stage that you might think about. And oftentimes, like the butterflies, we think about that adult stage, those caterpillar stages or those pupal stages when they're in the chrysalis. Those are also very, very important if we want a thriving butterfly population. Some of the other things to do Removing invasive species, these are non-native species that are problematic. Not all non-native species are invasive, but all invasive species are non-native. And so just because something attracts animals to it does not mean that it's supporting it. A great example of this is butterfly bush. It's something that is a butterfly magnet, and research has shown it's the scent that the butterfly bush puts off that really, really attracts those butterflies in. But again, this isn't supporting the life cycle of the butterflies. It might be giving them some nectar as adults, but it's not providing that habitat for any of the larvae of any of our local butterflies or moths. So it's taking space from other species and also changing the environment around it. And I often liken things like, butterfly bush to Doritos, right? So I love Doritos. I can smash a bag of Doritos, no problem. You open that bag, that's like that floral scent to me when I hear it and the crunch and all of that. But I know that Doritos are not good for my overall health and growth and all of that. So think about how some of these plants might just kind of be like junk food. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's a lot of emerging research that's also happening on lipid content and protein content and things like that. So when you're designing your habitat, when I started walking people through this, first things first is know your goals. Like, who do you want to attract, right? Are you interested in butterflies? Are you interested in bees? Are you interested in everything, right? So think about that, because that's ultimately going to play into some of the plants that you might want to select for your landscape. And it's also important to know your habitat, right? If you don't have a really big habitat, that's going to affect what types of things you can put out there. You probably want to focus on those high value species that are really going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. Think about the sun exposure that's in your habitat as well. This is a picture of my front yard from many years ago. You can still see all that sea of periwinkle that I have eradicated and since this picture is taken. But the front yard in my yard is complete shade in the summertime when everything is leafed out. Whereas my backyard is full sun. And surprisingly, even though my front and backyard are not very big, not very far from one another, the sun and the soil is very, very different. And that means that there are going to be very different plants that are supported in my front yard versus my backyard. So I have different goals for each of those areas. So consider those types of things, the sun and the soil. And yeah, you can plant these things in habitat and they might survive. But when those plants get stressed, makes them a lot more susceptible to disease and to insect pests. And just as an example, is early in my days of planting, I had to put swamp milkweed out in my backyard. I was like, I just love swamp milkweed. I put it out there, it grows, but it does not grow well. And every year, those oleander aphids, those little orange aphids, just destroy my swamp milkweed. But I've put in common milkweed and butterfly weed since then, which are more adapted to that drier habitat that I have in my backyard, and they don't get the same pressure because they're not as stressed out as that swamp milkweed. So keep that in mind, because sometimes you can solve your pest issues by putting plants in the right spot. So location matters. This is, when I teach my botany classes, I always talk about knowing what habitat you're in and what physiographic province that you're in. So I'm down in Anne Arundel County, which is considered to be the coastal plain. We have sandy, acidic soils, and it's actually slightly warmer than folks that might be in the Baltimore area, particularly as you get up north. You have different soils than me, and that several degree difference of temperature can sometimes make a big difference in what types of plants will ultimately grow in those habitats. And certainly as you move west and go up higher in elevation, that's also going to affect things. So this map breaks down Maryland into multiple regions, but mostly what we look at with the regions in Maryland, we look at the coastal plain. So everything kind of below that I-95 line there. That's going to be your coastal plain. On the western and the eastern shore, central Maryland is going to be made up mostly Baltimore County and Carroll County, Howard, Montgomery, all of that. That's going to be your Piedmont. are Central Maryland, and then Western Maryland is that skinny tip of Maryland. And so those are the different provinces that are referenced in this guide, which is an excellent guide, the native plants for wildlife habitat and conservation landscaping in the Chesapeake Bay region. So one of the resources that will be shared in the Wakelet that I have that actually links to this nativeplantcenter.net, and that is this analog essentially to this book. And what's really, really nice is you can go to that website and you can say, I live on the coastal plain, I want a shrub, and I have full sun, or I have, acidic soils. You can use those drop downs and it's going to spit out some recommended plants and it'll tell you those wildlife values for those plants. So it's a really helpful planning tool. Sometimes I also use resources like Maryland Biodiversity Project, and so this will tell you a little bit about plants that are found in your area as well. And so if they're growing naturally in your area, then it's usually a good sign that they can grow in your yard as well in those kind of cultivated conditions. So one of these examples is golden Alexanders. This is a great plant if you want black swallowtails. So this is the caterpillar of the black swallowtails. They feed on anything in the carrot family, Apiaceae family. So if you plant dill or fennel, you might have seen these black swallowtail caterpillars show up. But naturally, they would go after things like the golden Alexanders and Queen Anne's lace and those types of plants. So a few other things to consider before I get into some more recommendations about plants to put out there is, first and foremost, start small. I've seen a lot of people who have these big ambitions and dreams, which is fantastic, but it takes a lot of work to do these garden projects and to do them well. And I'd rather see you do it in small patches and see success than overwhelm yourself and, essentially give up. And I've seen that happen far too many times. So as I said, I have a small yard. It took me 10 years of hand pulling periwinkle and pachysandra and going back out there and doing it over and over again. It's gone. It's gone. I'm in maintenance mode. I only have a few things to pull. And now I'm focusing on planting these native plants. So start small, do patches, and make it manageable for you. And you're going to see these changes as you go along. If you've got a bigger space, think about varying bloom times. The most critical time of year for most of our pollinators are early in the spring and late in the fall. That's usually when nectar and pollen are the most limited. So if you can think about timing the blooms in your garden, making sure that you have spring food sources, summer food sources, and fall food sources, that's excellent. And they don't all have to be in the same area. So my front yard, again, full shade, so it's a great spot for a lot of those spring ephemeral flowers. So I have my spring garden out front. It's basically done for the year, and then I'll get some late summer flowers that will also come up in the garden. But my backyard is my summer garden because that's the full sun. So it is just getting ready for everything to pop. My woodland sunflowers, the blazing stars, all of that's getting ready. That's going to be that next set of food and blooms for the critters in my yard. So vary those bloom times. Think about planting in clumps too. This is something I did early on that I regret. I wanted one of everything. I was like, I want one of this, then I want this, then I want this, then I want this. But if you think about it, if you're a hungry butterfly flying over and you see one lone milkweed plant, that's not going to be enticing to you. You want to plant at least in clumps of 3 to 5. And that's really going to help support that food need and reduce the energy costs that these animals are expending to fly in between all of those flowers. I'll go over this in a little bit, but planting for the life cycle, really, really important for our pollinators. And then just a note of caution. This is an area of developing research, but be careful with some of the cultivars. Cultivars are intentionally like crossbred species or species that are bred for human traits. So they're usually bred for things like a longer bloom time or less disease susceptibility or something like that. But occasionally in that selective breeding process, you lose some of the things that are really important for those pollinators or for those animals that depend on it. For example, some cultivars have double flowers. Double flowers look beautiful to us, but those double flowers usually lack nectar and pollen, which is the food that they need. In the example here, this is from Dr. Annie White's research, and there was actually a cultivar. It was a cross between cardinal flower, which I love, and you can probably look at and see that this is a hummingbird plant. It was a cross between cardinal flower and great blue lobelia that resulted in this cultivar that you see right here. This cultivar is bigger, has bigger flowers than both the great blue lobelia and the cardinal flower. The great blue lobelia was designed for bumblebees, and cardinal flower is designed for hummingbirds. At least I shouldn't say designed, but they co-evolved with pollinator plant relationships. So this cross here was found to attract more hummingbirds than the traditional cardinal flower, but it actually had less nectar content than traditional cardinal flower. And so essentially the hummingbirds were spending more energy going to this cultivar, but getting less food in return. And so that's just something to caution. It's not all cultivars. We still have a lot of work to do. And then a cultivar of a native plant is going to be better than an invasive plant any day of the week. So if all your options are just native cultivars, go with that. But just consider that in the process, some of that selective breeding might cause some of the importance of those plants to be lost. So moving along to supporting the life cycles, one of the documents that is going to be in this wakelet that either Anne or Amanda can share the link in the chat with you all. It's going to show you the different butterfly species that are found in Maryland, what they lay their eggs on, aka their host plants, and then what the adults visit for their nectar plants. So some common life cycles that you might see in your yard include things like black swallowtails. As I said earlier, they feed on anything in the carrot family. So that includes non-native plants like dill and fennel and parsley, but it also includes native plants like the meadow ruse and the golden alexanders that I showed earlier. If you plant things like pawpaw in your yard, then that's going to support the life cycle of zebra swallowtails. Our spicebush swallowtails, as their name suggests, like things like spicebush and sassafras. And then our eastern tiger swallowtails love just about any woody plant out there. So it says sweet bay, magnolia, and willow, but they also are going to love things like cherries and all sorts of other tree species that you'll have in the area. And so this is that butterfly checklist that's linked in the wakelet that Anne just shared. It actually has the flight periods for certain adult butterflies, the general habitats, what they typically visit as adults, what they lay their eggs on, and then where in the state you're going to find them in terms of like the coastal plain or the Ridge and Valley, which is out there in the western region and all of that. So this gives you a good guidance on some of the different butterfly species in Maryland and what you might need to support them and support their life cycles if you want to attract them to your yard. So going back to like that coevolution of native plants and native pollinators, a lot of this work has been done by Dr. Doug Tallamy in Delaware and his different grad students. And it's just really, really surprising when you compare the top 5 woody plant species that are native in terms of hosting, supporting the life cycles of butterflies and moths versus the top 5 non-native. It's just, there's no comparison. Oaks are going to support over 500 species of Lepidoptera, the butterfly and moth species, whereas the top non-native, the things like Bradford pears, 138. And then it drops significantly. Lilacs, only 40 species compared to cherries, which are over 450 species. So even though some of these non-native plants might be attracting some and supporting some of these butterfly and moths, it's not going to be anywhere close to the numbers that you would see if you put a native plant in its place. Now, on the flip side, it is good to know that if you're planting these things for butterfly and moths to host on, you're going to see a lot of holes in your trees and in those leaves and all of that stuff. So it's good to temper those expectations. Wild cherries are excellent for Lepidoptera. Wild cherries should not be like a focal tree species in your front yard because it's going to look pretty scraggly with everything eating it, which is what you want. And that's why my wild cherries are in the back of the yard in a section that you can't see really well because everybody's chomping and chewing on them. So really briefly, I'm also going to bring up some other research that's just kind of emerging and developing, but we're learning about the nutritional needs of pollinators versus some of the things that plants provide. And it's probably no surprise that some plants have the right cocktails of nutrition for certain types of pollinators. So this graph right here is just showing the protein to lipid ratios of different plant families, and then looking at things like the needs of these different bee species. So things like the Bombus impatiens, which is one of our bumblebee species, it's going to need a pretty high protein to lipid ratio compared to something like the honeybee, which has, much different nutritional needs. So again, really, really developing stuff. This research is also linked in that Wakelet, but some things to consider that, hey, it might be really, really good for one animal, but not so good for other animals. And we're still learning about all of this. So now I'm going to jump into different types of plants that you might consider. And I tried to pick ones that are easy to find and easy to grow as just some examples to get you thinking about stuff. So common blue violet is one of those plants that's pretty ubiquitous in Maryland. You probably even have it growing in your lawn. And I've seen people just like go out and kill this stuff, but this is like a workhorse of a plant. There's a special ground nesting bee that pollinates blue violets, common blue violets. And then also it's the host plant for fritillary butterflies. And this picture of this wild creature is a chrysalis from my very own garden from my fritillary butterfly crop, thanks to keeping all of this common blue violet. And what I love about the violet, it's so easy to transplant. It grows in full shade and full sun, but it does get pretty aggressive in the right conditions. So it will, like, I transplanted a bunch in my butterfly garden and it totally took over, but at least it's really easy to manage in that regard. But it's supporting a whole number of species, and it's one of those things you just put in the ground and you walk away from. And that's what I really like, because I don't have a lot of time to baby plants. Another great workhorse in the garden is golden ragwort. I know there's a group that calls themselves like the Church of the Holy Pachyra, because they just love this stuff. It is really aggressive. It's semi-evergreen. It will spread throughout the yard, and it likes shade to part shade, but it can grow in some full sun conditions too. So it's another one of those plants that's going to provide for a lot of different species. As you can see, it's got those aster flowers, so it's going to support those bees in particular. And it's another one that's usually really, really good for the garden, except if you have a small space. Things like wild geranium, columbines. These columbines flower a little later in the spring. These are one of the few shade plants that is attractive to hummingbirds. And so at least our native columbine. Some of the non-native columbines from like the western region of the states are more purplish in color, and obviously those will be less attractive. Some woody spring plants. Red maple is actually that first really, really important pollen and nectar source for a lot of our early emerging bees. And so red maple, beautiful tree, really, really easy to grow, really common all around, and it's gorgeous throughout the year. So it has the beautiful red flowers in the spring, and in the fall it gets that beautiful red glow. It supports yellow-bellied sapsuckers in the winter. So lots of things are using red maples. We also have viburnums. Most of our viburnums are shrubs, like this maple-leaved viburnum here, which is one of our shorter viburnums. It only grows about 3 to 5 feet tall. And then we have them going all the way up to these small trees, like the cherry-leaved viburnum that grows a good 15, 20 feet. These are great flowers because they have the spring flowers that support our bees and our butterflies and all of that. Then in the fall, those pollinated flowers turn into fat packed fruits, which are perfect for migrating birds. And so all of these like viburnums, those fruits are going to ripen right during peak migration season. So that's going to be really important for our birds in the area. Black willow, willows actually are very high pollen protein plants for our bees. There's some specialist bees that use willows. You don't see willow as much in the nursery trade, probably because it's kind of aggressive and it can be a water-seeking plant. But if it's growing wild in different areas, it is a very good plant for a number of bee species. Moving on to summer. So as I said, we're starting to get into that summer time frame for our plants. You got wet soils or slightly wet soils, put bee balm out there. It's amazing. It's going to bring in those hummingbirds and you're just going to love it. This is the wild bergamot. This is what I have in my garden as a drier liking species. And this is going to bring in a lot of solitary wasp. And I'll talk about them in a little bit, but they're really good at pest control in the garden. And obviously you can see my common eastern bumblebee visiting the wild bergamot too. Spotted bee balm, really, really cute. It loves really, really dry, crappy soils. So sandy soils, you got it, then get some spotted bee balm. So another great workhorse of a plant are mountain mints. There are a number of different mountain mints that are found in Maryland. And they're one of like the top pollinator plants from some of the Penn State trials in terms of the number of visitations by the different pollinator species. Now, all of these are mints, and if you have experience with mints, either native mints or horticultural mints, you will know that they self-seed and spread really, really easily. So do keep that in mind. Again, not something you put in small spaces, but at least the things like bee balms, wild bergamot, and spotted bee balm are really easy to hand pull if they get too aggressive. Some of the mountain mints, you got to put a little more elbow grease into keeping them in check. But mountain mints are, I like have a small patch right by where I park my car. And when I went into work every day, it was my favorite thing coming home was just seeing all the little critters that were on the mountain mints when I got home after work. I just stand out there for like 15, 20 minutes. My husband's like, you gonna come inside for dinner? And I'm like, I'm watching the bees. But it's a great, great plant. And put out a couple and you have, mountain mint for life, which I think sounds pretty awesome. Some other summer nectar plants, the liatris or blazing stars, are also another one of the favorites. They come from these like little bulb-like corms, so you can actually buy them, quite a bit of them, rather cheaply from a lot of garden centers. And it's going to bring in a lot of these solitary wasps. So this is a thread-waisted wasp from my garden. They're really good because they're good at pest control. And some of these wasps eat spiders, some of these wasps eat other wasps, some of these wasps eat, or parasitize aphids. So when you bring some of these wasps into your garden, you're getting your own free pest control too. So it helps keep nature's balance out there. And the solitary wasps are just like the solitary bees. They're single moms. She ain't got time to sting you. She's got a lot of other things on her mind, so don't worry about being stung by them. They're really, really chill in the wasp world. If you're down in the coastal plain, one supplement, it's not the same as butterfly bush, but it is a butterfly magnet when it flowers, a sweet pepper bush or plethora. This stuff smells wonderful. It is always covered in tiger swallowtails. And I say that, my only qualm against this plant is that it doesn't bloom long enough. I would love to have a longer bloom time for the sweet pepper bush because you'd see a lot of stuff coming in. But that's a slight alternative to the butterfly bush. Same thing goes with Joe Pyeweed. Going to grow really, really tall. It likes a slightly wetter environment, so if you got a rain garden or a spot that stays a little wet, this would be something good to put out there. And it is another one of those butterfly supporting plants. As we get into the fall season, a lot of our asters are where it's going to be at. So things like bone sets, the little asters like white wood aster. This is actually one of our shade asters that will see itself seed in. Really, really important. Goldenrods. There are goldenrods for sun. There are goldenrods for shade. There are goldenrods that flower early summer and fall and all of that. These are other plants that are workhorses in terms of supporting numbers of pollinators. So this is a blue-winged wasp here, another one of our beneficial wasp species. Goldenrods are really, really important for our monarchs. This is that fuel that's going to get those monarchs to make it south to Mexico. And some of the research along the East Coast has found it's not the lack of milkweed that's causing the monarch declines, it's the lack of these late season nectar plants. They don't have enough lipid on their bodies, enough fat to be able to get south to Mexico. And so that's why these plants like the asters and the goldenrods are really going to help them along the way. If you want pops of color, New England asters and New York asters are beautiful purple colors, and they'll stay purple from September into October. So you can get some nice fall colors out in your yard by putting in some of these asters out there. If you don't have a lot of space, you can put in things like plants in your pots, right? So this is what I did before I got into my my garden, my backyard and all of that. I just had a deck. Trumpet honeysuckle. This is our native honeysuckle. This stuff is wild. It blooms almost continuously from April through October. And then when it's done blooming, it produces berries that things like the wrens and such will eat. So this is my hummingbird feeder because I don't have to clean it. It cleans itself, essentially. And there are hummingbird moths that host on the trumpet honeysuckle. So then you get the hummingbird moths and the hummingbirds together in your backyard. How cool is that? So there are some annual non-native plants too, like pentas and other things that will bring stuff in. So these are cheap plants that you can get at the store that still are going to help out pollinators, maybe not support the full life cycle, but if that's all you got, that's better than nothing, right? Putting out things like dill and parsley and fennel, also, good. If you're planting parsley for yourself, though, overplant because those black swallowtail caterpillars truly are hungry, and they will decimate all the parsley. And I actually gave up growing parsley myself because I was like having to go out to get more parsley for my caterpillars because I just couldn't take the parsley away from the caterpillars. So purple cone flowers, you can put them in the ground or you can grow them in pots. And mountain mint can also grow in pots too if you've got full sun. So those are all possibilities for you there. So one of the documents that's in the Wakelet too are these plants for pest control. These plants that are going to bring in some of those predatory solitary wasps and some of those things like ladybugs who have the carnivorous larval stage and stuff like that. So there's some of this research that's coming out. This old habitat that I wrote has some of these plants. It has this this graph there, but also the work coming out of Dr. Heather Holmes' lab. She's got a lot of great work, and I have her page linked in the Wakelet as well on how to support wasp in your yard. And that's ultimately going to help you with your own natural pest control. So you don't have to think about pesticides. You got that nice predator-prey balance thing going on in your backyard. So in addition to planting, thinking about other ways to provide for those pollinators, that other habitat that they need. Certainly leaving the leaves in the fall, super important. And when you think about leaving the leaves, think about where those pollinators are going to be overwintering. They're not going to be overwintering in your lawn, okay? But in your garden spaces, under your trees, those spots that need soft landings, that's where you really, really want to leave the leaves. So leave those leaves in your yard through the fall, in the winter. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's going to provide that habitat for numbers of species. Wood piles, also super important too. There are a lot of butterflies that will actually overwinter in wood piles, like morning-cloak butterflies, and bees that will overwinter in wood piles. Now, note of caution about wood piles, everybody loves them, including mice, rats, and snakes. So wood piles should always be at least 100 feet from the foundation of your house. Because if you have a wood pile up close to your house, it's going to bring in the mice, which is going to bring in the snakes, and they're eventually going to find their way indoors, and you're going to have some issues there. So I like mice because I love rodents. I like snakes too. I do not like either of them in my house. I prefer snakes in the house over mice, but just to get rid of all that, wood pile away from the foundation of the house, okay? Keep them nice and away. If you can keep areas that are open too, with that open sandy soil, providing that mud, and mud's going to provide nesting materials, but also nesting spaces for things like those solitary bees. And so this is a great example of a solitary bee colony. And they do not have those bright warning colorations like yellow jackets, which also nest in the ground. So that'll be one of the key factors that you can see the difference there. So yellow jackets also, those social wasps are going to be coming all out of one hole. You're going to have one entrance that everybody is using as opposed to a single hole or a single bee. Okay. There are ways to provide artificial nests and all of this. I used to push this a lot early in my days of talking about gardening for pollinators, but I do it a little bit less now because now I kind of go towards the sentiment of providing natural nesting structures. You can put these artificial nesting structures out there. I have resources that are in that wakelet that I'll have put in the chat again. But there are a lot of like sideboards that you really have to do. You have to make sure you keep these things clean. So 1 year for bamboo and paper tubes, max of 2 years for wood. Otherwise, parasites are going to build up in there, and then those houses are going to unintentionally start killing those bees that you're attracting them to. So keep that in mind, and also make sure that those tubes are nice and long, because the way that the bees use these, the females lay female eggs towards the back of the tube and males towards the front. So if you have too short of tubes in your nest, artificial nest structures, they're only going to lay male eggs, and you're not going to get that full life cycle there. So these are all those natural nesting sites, snags, standing dead trees that provide that that habitat is better than any bee house, bat house, bird house you could ever put up. And sometimes when you lose the trees, you don't have to take down the whole tree. So we just had to have a chestnut oak removed from our front yard, super sad, but it was going to fall either on our house or our neighbor's house. But the compromise was that we left 10 feet of the bole up, because those 10 feet don't matter if it falls. But those 10 feet of that dead trunk that's still sitting in my yard, that is woodpecker haven. And there's all sorts of other insects that are using it. I've got mushrooms all over it. It is habitat for a lot of things. And so standing dead trees, if they're not a threat to people, pets, or property, leave them up. Fallen logs, anything that's decaying, soft woody branches, those stems of things like the bergamots and the goldenrods and all of that, those are those nesting resources that those tunnel nesting bees would naturally use. So keep that in mind. I'll always limit pesticide and fungicide use. I am a proponent of smart pesticide use. There are situations that you just can't get anywhere without using pesticides, but they're better once used than others. So one of the resources that I have linked in the wakelet is this thing from Cornell University about pollinator protection guides and certain pesticides. Make sure you're protecting yourself. So make sure you're wearing proper gear and all of that, the gloves, the long pants, all of that, even if it's 90 degrees outside. Make sure you're following those directions to a T. Make sure you've exhausted other options, like making sure that you're putting plants in the right place, that it's getting enough water, it's not stressed, that alternatives like hand pulling isn't going to work, right? Avoid broadcast use and systemics, and think about that targeted use, and encourage natural predators like those flower flies that are pollinators. Well, this is a picture of them in my yard. The maggots, the larval stage, eating those oleander aphids. So they do double duties as pollinators and predators in the garden. Sometimes places like lawns are also nursery habitat for a lot of those annoying animals, like Japanese beetles and rose chafers. They grow up in lawn habitat. Less lawn means less Japanese beetles and rose chafers. And just because something's organic does not mean it's not toxic. So just keep that in mind. Supporting research, also important. Taking photos of these things, your monarchs, bumblebees, all of that, uploading them to things like iNaturalist, participating in things like the Xerces Society Firefly Atlas and stuff like that. That's going to help contribute to overall understanding of these insect nest or insect population structures. There are a lot more of you out there than scientists out there. And so having more eyes on the ground and submitting this research is really going to help us understand the structure of these populations and where these things are. And there are a lot of really awesome resources out there. I cannot talk up Heather Holmes' books enough. She's got one on bees, and I've got one on wasps. And this bee guide is amazing. You want to plant for bees. It has information about the different bee species. It tells you plants, and then also time of year and all sorts of other stuff. So this is really good. Life cycles of butterflies is good for very like 20 common species of butterflies. And there are a whole host of other resources that are also out there. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and take some questions, which I see a couple have come into the chat already.
Kerry, I'm going to step in here really quick and do a quick little plug for our Wild Ones group. If anybody is interested in helping us grow the group by volunteering or a membership at baltimore.wildones.org. Also, there are two sister groups in the area. There's Wild Ones Chesapeake Bay, which is a wonderful group, and also a new group in Frederick. And then we also encourage you to go to the Maryland Native Plant Society, which has been around for a long time, and they've got wonderful programs going on too. So Kerry, go ahead and continue there.
All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and allow folks to unmute themselves. So I saw a question about what I replace my periwinkle with. That's been a long, long journey. So typically what I would do when I would remove periwinkle from an area, I would do it in patches, and then I would replant it with annuals. So I would often get like non-native annuals like marigolds and stuff like that and put that out there just to have it covered. And then the next year, it usually take me 2 to 3 years to get those extra fragments of periwinkle. Once I felt like I was at a good point with the periwinkle being gone, then I would plant different things. I've planted things like ferns, Christmas fern, maidenhair fern, lady fern, wild geranium. I've put the golden ragwort, all sorts of stuff out there. So I get a whole swath of different species now in what used to be a monoculture of periwinkle. So it's pretty awesome. And I saw a question too about buying predatory insects. It's actually better to attract predatory insects than to buy them. So some of these animals are put in very crowded conditions, which makes it easier for disease to be transferred in. And then in terms of things like ladybugs, there aren't very many regulations on wild collection of ladybugs. And so some of these ladybugs are unsustainably harvested from the wild and sold in stores. And then we have things like these non-native Chinese mantids being sold for pest control, and some of them can have a greater negative impact than positive impact in the garden. So I usually suggest just, when you plant it, they will come. You'll be really, really surprised what will show up and what's in the area, but you just have to kind of give nature time, and that will work out there. And I see a question.
Sorry. I was going to say there was one other question about bats, supporting bats as pollinators.
Yeah. So none of our bats in Maryland are pollinators. All 10 species plus the 3 bonus species that might become part of Maryland are all insectivores. So insects are going to help them out. And so some of the things that you do to support our native insects, like planting native plants and reducing pesticide use, that's going to help out the bats. Another thing that's going to help out the bats and our nocturnal pollinators is turning off the lights at night or putting your lights on timers or sensors and that type of thing, because light pollution at night is affecting a lot of insects. It affects bats and also migrating birds during peak migration season. So anything you can do to reduce light pollution will help all of the above, essentially.
I think we have one more question about, let's see, I think there were two. Okay, what I'm looking at is about making a pollinator garden on top of a concrete slab. Does it matter if the garden is made up of many smaller containers versus few large containers?
I really think that depends on what you pick for those containers. You know, some of these plants can grow in smaller containers, and some of them have bigger root systems and all of that that are going to need larger containers. And then also in terms of your maintenance as well, like how easy is it going to be to maintain multiple small containers versus like upkeeping one? So those would be the things that I would consider in terms of that. I don't think it really matters to the pollinators if it's broken up into several small containers, because even if you've got things like caterpillars, if they're close enough to one another, they will be able to crawl over to the other container to get to the food. So.
Okay, we have a question about leaves. Somebody has kind of a dense number of leaves in their backyard. And they say, are there any native plants you could suggest that do well with hollies, oaks, and slugs? I guess their existing plants are struggling.
Sounds like my yard. So yeah, I have chestnut oaks, and then I have American holly. I have one American holly that kind of is the bane of my garden. I like it. It does support wildlife, but I really hate gardening under it because of the pokey needle leaves. So there are a lot of expletives when I garden under it. Um, Under my holly, I've had success with ferns and things like that. And then in some areas with that chestnut oak that I have, the leaf litter gets so deep, and naturally things like fire would come through and burn off that leaf litter, which obviously is not happening in suburban Anne Arundel County. And so during the late spring, once the temperatures have gotten kind of like in that consistent 60-degree area, that's when I go and I start removing some of those excess oak leaves from the backyard or from the yard, and I start putting them out in my composting area and everything. I do it late spring because if anybody is overwintering and I disturb them, it's still hopefully warm enough that they can go find forage or find cover elsewhere. Um, it's all about that kind of balance and stuff, but I can't have thick oak leaf litter and ground covers like wild ginger, which struggles under all those oak leaves. So I do have to remove some of it.
So it looks like we have a couple more questions. I guess we could wrap it up after that unless anyone else wants to post a question. How does that sound, Kerry?
Sure.
Okay. Let me just look at these here. We have native species good for both pollination and erosion control, part to moist shade, part to most shade, sorry.
Part to most shade. That's a hard one. If it's not a very steep slope, something like that, Pachyra, the golden ragwort, might be a good compromise there, because it is something that's going to thrive in some of those shadier habitats, and it's going to spread really well. But it's not going to be really good for erosion control because it does have a thin root system. So if you have, if it's a really steep slope and you really need that erosion control, you might have to make some concessions and try to get something that, like some of those grasses that are going to have those deeper root systems to hold the soil in, that are going to have less flowers, but some of the grasses are also host plants for skippers and some of the smaller butterflies. So one of the fast growing grasses is wild oat or sea oats. And sea oats is a really good spreading grass. It does support some skipper species. It's pretty, but do not plant that in a small area or an area you don't want it to like spread in. So I planted it in my tiny butterfly area, and I'm still removing sea oats because it was just supposed to be a fill-in plant for a little bit, but it does so well in those conditions. So if you need that erosion control, I go for grasses. Really, if you need it, if you want more of the pollination, then think about things like the golden ragwort.
Great. So how many more questions? It looks like there's maybe 5 more questions. How many more would you like to do?
I can continue answering, and if people have to drop off, y'all can drop off when you want.
So we have, should those bare muddy soil areas for the bees be in shade or sunny areas?
Good question. Most of the time, they're going to be best in sunny areas and close to whatever pollen or nectar source. So if you think about these females have to make like 20 to 40 trips to make one little, partition in her nest structure. You don't want to make 20 to 40 1 mile trips, like half a mile or shorter. If you're thinking about bees, like a couple feet or shorter would be really good. So yeah, keeping everything together is going to help them out. There are some bees that use shady areas, but most of them are going to need sun and flowers.
Okay. Question for one of your photos, Kerry. Someone said they saw some mayaples in your front yard. What tree is above it?
Oh, that's a good question. So, yes, I do have mayaples. The natural overstory is chestnut oaks, which is surprising having mayaples under it. The tree in that picture is the Japanese maple that my husband loves, but I do not love. So that is one of our compromises in the yard. So occasionally you do have to have those compromises, and that's one of the trees that has not died yet that I
I
don't.
think, I think that's important for gardeners to know because sometimes people think that they have to remove absolutely everything, including things that
Yes.
they're loved to them, and that's not the case.
Yeah,
Unless it's an invasive, and then yes, it is the case.
I mean, yes, the Japanese maple is an invasive, but my husband also lets me do just about anything else in the yard. So it's like, yeah, you sometimes you have to do that compromise, and it is slowly dying from the yellow-bellied sapsucker damage that's been happening to it. Yeah, I know, right? And like every now and again, I think about helping it along, but I haven't done that yet. So.
Okay, off-topic question. Are Juro spiders something to be afraid
Adrienne, look on Facebook.
of?
No. Okay, so you've probably seen all of the press and everything about these giant spiders that sound like they're flying through the sky and are probably going to fall on you and eat your children. None of that is true. The Juro spiders are in Maryland. They've been in Maryland for at least 2 years. They are not native. They, are from Asia, and so the thing about them that the media is sensationalizing right now is how they disperse. If you're a fan of Charlotte from Charlotte's Web, at the end, you might remember that all her little babies, after she dies, fly off into the distance on their little silken threads. That's a technique called ballooning that's used by a number of spider species, a number of orb weavers like Charlotte from Charlotte's Web, a number of long-jawed orb weavers, even some of our wolf spiders, the lycosids, will use that ballooning technique, crab spiders and all of that. The thing is that they're super, super tiny, and that's how it works. They're really, really tiny. They throw that silk up into the air, and the static electricity basically like floats them off. And the way that the news articles are writing it, it makes it seem like these adult giant spiders are the ones flying through the air, which is not physically possible. So they're not going to drop on you and as big giant spiders. You've probably had baby spiders float by you and you had no idea. Actually, I'll say you have had baby spiders float by you and not have any idea. They have venom just like the majority of our spider species, but they are not medically significant, like black widows. So even if they were to bite you, not really much of a concern there. And they haven't been documented to have strong negative impacts where they've been introduced so far. They've been in Georgia for like 10, 15 years now, and they're just now becoming, something that the news media has picked up because of a study that was done about climate change and how they can stand a larger thermal range than what was previously thought. So don't worry about Joro spiders.
You can sleep tonight, Adrian.
Yeah.
Okay. Couple more questions. Does Anemone canadensis support insects?
Ooh, that's a good question. I imagine it does. So those anemone flowers, I know there are quite a few solitary bees that will use other anemones. So I don't know about that species in particular, but I'm sure you could try to look it up and something's got to use it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we have a really unusual question, which is probably a little bit left here of center, but somebody wanting to know if there's anything they can plant in their yard to help pull ants out of their house. I thought that was sort of a quirky question. We're all dealing with that, but I
Yeah,
think
with ants in the house. Well, the
sleep on
key is to figure out what ants are in your house too. And sometimes these animals in the house are a symptom of a problem. So like I always used to say, if you got snakes in the house, you've got a mouse problem first and a snake problem second. And if you got those big black ants in your house, those are typically the carpenter plant ants. And they are actually the ones that are attracted to rotting wood. So if you have carpenter ants, you've got rot somewhere. They're not destroying the wood; they're going after wood that's already rotten. And as a personal experience, we had them. They kept showing up in the kitchen, and my husband is compromised. He pulled out the insect spray as soon as it happened, and I was like, "No, no, we have to watch them where they're going." And we watched them, and of course, they were coming in right by our sliding glass door. And when he pulled the framing off the outside, huge rotted section on the outside. So they were telling us that, our door frame was rotting out. And that's what we had to do is just replace the wood and boom, no more giant carpenter ants. Now those little tiny ants, some of those like, oh, I forget the name of them, but they have like this slight smell when you squish them. A lot of times they're coming in because of dispersal in the spring and they're going after sugars and stuff like that. So those types of things, one of the best controls is to get stuff like taro ant killer, the borax solution basically. That will take care of any of those sweet ants that are coming indoors and looking to expand their territories inside. And other than that, leave them outside because they're food for a lot of stuff. Even termites are food for stuff too. So as long as they're far enough away from the house, there's something that can benefit a lot of other creatures.
I liked your carpenter ant story. I think it kind of really ties in well with a lot of stuff you've been talking about, is to use your powers of observation and study nature around you and get involved and see what's going on. And
Yeah, you'll be surprised at how many house pests are telling you about problems. Like we had all these little moths that started showing up, and I was like, these are grain moths. And my husband's beer malt downstairs, he had a big bin of barley or whatnot. And apparently it wasn't fully sealed, so we were growing moths in the basement. So, yeah.
so Kerry, I know you're involved in a lot of things. How can people help support your efforts?
Biggest thing is educating others. So taking this knowledge and passing it on. And that's why I still do a lot of this as volunteer work, because I see the change that it has when you go out and teach other people and pass that knowledge on, and lead by example in your yard too. So, even little things that you do in your yard, you bring your neighbors in, your family, and you talk about it, you can make some big changes. So I think that's one of the best things that you can do.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Anne, for helping out with this meeting, and everyone else who's a member, and friends that will become members, and whether it's our group or one of the other Wild Ones groups or Maryland Native Plant Society. It's all good. Share what you know with your neighbors and set a good example with your native plant garden. And look to our website for more events, and feel free to contact us with your questions and suggestions for the group. And we're always looking for more volunteers so that we can do more fun things for you guys. All right. Thank you, Kerry.